Tale Foundry.
March has arrived, and that means St. Patrick's Day is just around the corner. If you're Irish, awesome. Enjoy celebrating your heritage. But if you're like the rest of us, well, enjoy celebrating green and corned beef, beer, this weird green jelly stuff, and, whatever this is. I mean, it's a leprechaun, obviously, but it's kinda weird, right? It's just a little man in green clothes with magic stuff. I understand the food and the beer, those things make sense, but why are we using this thing to celebrate? Turns out there's actually a pretty good reason. Back during the melting pot, when immigrants from all over were flocking to America, there was a lot of xenophobia, which is basically a big word for racism, and one of the groups that struggled with it were the Irish. So, in an effort to fight off some of that bigotry and become more integrated into American society, St. Patrick's Day parades and celebrations became more inclusive, more focused on creating a positive image for the Irish people. Cue the leprechaun. These little guys were of almost no significance to Ireland itself. But to America, it's a different story, because in America, one of our first real introductions to Irish culture was a story about leprechauns. Yeah, Darby O'Gill and the Good People did more to fight racism than hundreds of years of Irish parades and festivals. It gave Irish Americans a sort of endearing avatar, something that made them non-threatening, even lovable, just by association. Of course, the leprechaun wasn't invented to be a mascot for the Irish. Honestly, they hardly pay leprechauns any attention at all. Across the pond, they're just one fairy tale among many. Which is interesting, because that's not how they started. Before there were leprechauns, there were little people. Everywhere. From Greek pygmies to Norse dwarves to German kobolds, the world was, and I guess still is, overrun with tiny folk. One of the worst infestations was in Ireland, where they had little cobblers living under the hills, house spirits for everything imaginable, and legions of ambiguous fairies. The stories these creatures came from were so diverse and specific to the people telling them that you end up with some really unique ideas. For instance, there were people who maintained that a tiny, perpetually drunken man called a clurachaun, a close cousin of the leprechaun, guarded their wine cellar. And that's all it did. Amazing, right? But the first written story that included an actual leprechaun was the saga of Fergus MacLeody, which chronicled the adventures of a supposed king of Ulster. In one of the tales, Fergus falls asleep on the beach, and when he wakes up, he finds that a troop of little men are dragging him toward the water, presumably to drown him. He catches them in his hands, and they offer him 3 wishes in exchange for their freedom. And that's it. Pretty exciting, huh? I mean, that barely qualifies as a cameo, and they really don't even sound that much like leprechauns. Yeah, they're small and they grant wishes, but when was the last time you heard of a leprechaun that lives underwater? And worse, they weren't even called leprechauns. They were lúchorpáin, which means small body or little people. So we're sort of back to square one. Although, there does seem to be a little debate on this point. Some sources say that lúchorpáin does in fact mean little people, but others suggest another possible meaning, something far more significant. We'll get back to this, but first we need to go way back to a time before little people, before Irish fairy tales, before Ireland itself. Our story really starts with the Tohededanin, the tribe of the gods. Legends say that some of Ireland's first settlers were a race of beautiful godlike figures who landed on the shore shrouded in a great mist. When they arrived, they burned their ships, subdued the native tribes, and made the island their home. And they were good rulers. Like anyone, they struggled with warfare and dissent, but their people were safe and happy, in no small part because their kings were basically gods. One of the more important figures among the Tohededanin was Lugh, a high king and war hero who has since become the patron god of light. Among many things, he was known for his mastery of all crafts and for being a trickster. When he died, he left his kingdom in a state of relative peace, which persisted for many long years after. But everything changed when the Milesians attacked. They landed on Ireland and a war immediately broke out between them and the Tohededanin. It lasted for years, but eventually the invaders won out and banished the Tohedadanen beneath the Shea Mountains, where they became the Eas Shi, the people of the Mound. As time moved on, the people of Ireland began to drift away from their old mythology. Legends of the Tohedadanen became fairy tales, and new creatures began to take their place. And so, the little people of Ireland were born, caricatures of the gods who had once ruled. So, back to that first appearance of the leprechaun, the lúchorpáin. The word might not actually mean small body. It might mean small, stooping lúch, as in lúch, one of the high kings of the Tohedadanen. If that's true, it could mean that the leprechaun is just a parody of an old pagan god. Now, that hardly covers everything. What about the crock of gold at the end of the rainbow, the green clothes, the affinity for alcoholic beverages? Well, a lot of that just comes down to the fact that this is a folktale. As people heard these stories, they had a tendency to embellish them, to make them personal by combining elements from stories they've heard in the past and things from real life. In a way, folktales and fairy tales are like some of the world's oldest fan fiction. And that's probably the most important part of this whole origin story. The leprechaun exists because of the stories people chose to tell. Stories that didn't depict the old Irish gods as heroes or rulers, but as little people. Fairies and leprechauns and other fun, but relatively insignificant, creatures. And hey, when every story you hear makes the things you believe in sound silly or childish, you might find yourself reconsidering your worldview. On the positive side, when the most popular stories about your culture are fun and generally agreeable, people are more likely to view you in that light. Storytelling isn't just for entertainment. It has a real impact. It can both raise gods and put them to bed. It can fight or promote racism. The stories you tell are important. Just something to think about while you're sitting at the table staring down that pile of corned beef. As always, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Opinions, suggestions, anything. Just leave a comment below or join the discussion on our Facebook page. You can click subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, or click submit if you have a story you want us to share. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I'll see you next time.